Welcome everybody to our next session. Today I am delighted to welcome two wonderful writers who will be in conversation and reading. Professor Lawrence Hill is Professor of Creative Writing at the University of Guelph, Ontario. Professor Hill helped to create an annual common reading programme, Griffin's Read, which features BIPOC and queer writers at the University of Guelph. He is the author of 11 books of fiction and non-fiction, including his most recent novel written especially for young people, Beatrice and Croc Harry, about a young girl who awakens alone with amnesia in a massive forest. Here, every conceivable fish, bird, mammal, and reptile coexist. But Beatrice does not know who she is, and the story weaves questions of identity and a search for justice. And I am about to order this for my two daughters, actually, having read about it. Professor Hill's writing has won numerous awards, such as the National Magazine Award, the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and the Rogers Writers' Trust Fiction Prize, as well as Canada Reads twice. Blackberry Sweet Juice, On Being Black and White in Canada, was Professor Hill's memoir of personal stories detailing how his parents met and married and what it was like growing up in an otherwise entirely white Toronto suburb. The memoir also talks about how his own children see themselves in a country where issues of racial identity are often ignored. Professor Hill's third novel, The Book of Negroes 2007, is really going to be much of the focus of today's conversation. It was published in some countries as Someone Knows My Name and in French as Aminata, after the main character. The book takes its title from the very important manuscript archive book of the same name. And in this manuscript are the names of 3,000 Black people who had served George III in the war and were fleeing to Manhattan for Canada in 1783, seeking freedom and safety. As Hill says, unless your name was in the Book of Negroes, you could not escape to Canada. So there's something there about textuality and archive, history and Black freedom. His novel is the story of Aminata Diallo, a compelling character who is abducted as a child from her village in Bayou, Niger, and is forced to walk for months to the sea before crossing the Middle Passage and being enslaved in South Carolina. And again, there's a tie to Equiano, who is in South Carolina as well. Years later, she finds her way to freedom, serving the British in the Revolutionary War, and becoming, in fact, the scribe who writes the Book of Negroes itself. Part of the novel, and a very painful and a poignant part of the novel, deals with Aminata finding a way back to the west coast of Africa. She's always searching for her village on the map, and she can't see it on any Western map. And she tries to find her village again. And this is also a feature of Equiano's story, Isaka, his village, which many West African archaeologists have tried to find as well. So Aminata then returns to England with abolitionists, where she tells her tale, much like the real woman Mary Prince did, and also like Equiano did, to bring about abolition. We are honoured to have Professor Hill here with us today as part of Global Equiano. Professor Hill will be in conversation with Dr. Ife Adeniyi, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of English at the University of Winnipeg. Her debut novel, On the Bank of the River, was published in Nigeria in 2015 and was longlisted for the Etisalat Prize for Literature. It tells the story of Enitan, a teenage girl who is from the village of Obade in Osun State, who then moves to Lagos. The river itself has a large role to play in the novel, which blends perspectives and different timelines in a story about the need for love and solace. So welcome to you both, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kerry, for that wonderful introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here with you, Lawrence Hill. I must say that you are an inspiring force for many writers, and your written works are so impressive. So I was thoroughly enthralled reading your historical novel, The Book of Negroes, which we'll be discussing today. Aminata Diallo stands out as a character I cannot forget in a long time, not only because of the immense strength and vision she espouses, but even more so, the ode of the character on the imagination. How the impossible experience of Atlantic slavery can produce such indelible character is a paradox that befuddles me. And I would like to read a short passage that underlies the strength of this character and then ask you my first set of questions, if you don't mind.
Of course.
So Aminata, during the ocean passing, said about our enslavers, let them do what they wanted with my body on land. Then at least my spirit would travel and I would return home to my ancestors and I would no longer be alone. So that is on page 78 of the HarperCollins edition. So my question to you, Lawrence, is how did you come to write about Aminata Diallo, and how could the experience of slavery produce such a profound character with such incredible humanity?
Thank you so much, Ife, for welcoming me and for being a novelist yourself and for hosting this conversation. And thank you to Carrie as well for organizing the conference. How did I come to imagine this novel, and what about the creation of Aminata in the context of slavery? I guess I would say, first of all, that maybe to answer a bit of the second question first, although Aminata is enslaved from her village in Bayo, which was in the country we now understand to be Mali, actually, in West Africa. And although she's taken, forcibly from her village, marched across the continent to Sierra Leone and put on a slave vessel and sent overseas to be enslaved in the province of South Carolina, as South Carolina is still a British province. Um, she only spends a short period of the novel in slavery. And most of the novel, she's a free woman striving for dignity and freedom and trying to forge her life and trying to fight for the eradication of the slave trade and so forth. So there's much of the novel in which she's not at all enslaved. In the majority of the novel, she's a free woman. But she is, of course, enslaved in the beginning as she's captured from her village. And so it's not, to my mind, a novel especially about slavery, as much as it is a novel about a woman's life in and out of the time of enslavement in North America, including Canada, and about her dignity, about her resilience, about her efforts to get back home. And I guess when I conceive of of any novel, one of the first questions I ask myself is, can I say in a sentence, what does my character want, even if it never appears on the page? How could I explain to myself in one sentence what does she or he want uh, ultimately? And indeed, in Aminata's case, the answer is I want to go home because she's abducted at the age of she doesn't know for sure, but she's about 11 or 12. She's just about to enter puberty. She's old enough to have a good memory of where she comes from and the land from which and the people from which she was stolen, but young enough to have this naive and almost impossible ideal and dream to return home one day. And so she wants to go home. And that driving force motivates every action that she undertakes in the novel. The first question you asked was, how did I come to write the book? Well, there are so many answers to that, but I guess one of the first is that I've worked a few times as a volunteer in West African countries when I was a young man in my 20s and 30s. And I did go to work and live for a few months in Mali and lived in a village, much like the one in which Aminata is born and raised until she's abducted. And I think in that experience, although I had no idea at the time I was going to write the Book of Negroes, marked me profoundly. I was in a polygamous Muslim village. Uh, there were no roads or water or running water or electricity or doctors or anything like that. And I was living with people who'd often never seen people from North America before, and it was a profound experience for me. And I met a midwife named Aminata, who was catching babies all by herself in a little home that was barely bigger than uh, you'd find in a bathroom or something in Canada, just a small home that she was catching babies in all by herself with no medical backup and no tools, except her own hands, her skill, clean water, soap, and so forth. And so that experience marked me profoundly. I ended up naming my eldest daughter after Aminata, and then naming the character in my novel after my daughter, Aminata. Well, her name is Genevieve Aminata. I guess it was a long process, but I'd always wanted to sort of let a woman's voice come forth and narrate an entire book. And I felt that interest building in me in earlier books. And finally, when it came time to write the Book of Negroes, I felt ready to try to write in the voice of a woman and to write a fictionalized slave narrative, which I really wanted to do. I've always been struck by the beauty, the rawness, the vulnerability, the intensity, the transparency of slave narratives. And I wanted to write a fictional one.
Mm. Thank you for telling us about the story before the story. And now I can see that there are so many Aminatas in your life.
Yes, there are
Well,
happily.
some writers say that the main characters of their works never leave them, even years after writing the story. So my sense is rather that such characters had probably haunted the imagination of such writers, a reason that they have been written in the first place. So I wonder if you felt haunted by Aminata Diallo after writing this book.
Well, for sure. I also felt haunted by her before writing the book. Um, you know how it is when you're walking in traditional markets in small villages in countries like Mali or Niger or Cameroon, where I've lived and worked as volunteer. Um, you'll often see children and adults, but children especially, walking with big baskets of fruit on their heads, perfectly balanced, strolling through a marketplace. They might have 20 oranges or 30 in that basket on their heads, and they're just sauntering along like nobody's business, and nothing's falling off their head. Something that most Canadians, myself included, could never do, walk with a bunch of things on our head balance. And I had a photo on my wall of a girl whose photo I'd taken when I was living in Mali, who had such a basket on her head in the marketplace. And I just kept that photo there in the entire time that I was writing the novel, because I was trying to summon the image that I might have of Aminata in her village in Bayo, this fictional village of Bayo in Mali, before her abduction. And so she was haunting me for a long time before. I think she haunted me before Ife, because I was worried. I felt this story building in me and I wanted to do it justice. And I was worried that I wouldn't do it justice, that I'd fail tremendously. And I was worried about failure and not rendering my character, with the justice required, with the deftness necessary. And so I was worried, and it stayed with me for a long time before I started writing. Needed to write another few books first to sort of warm up for the Book of Negroes, and then wrote it over 5 years. So she haunted me for the 5 years of writing. And of course, she stayed with me after. There have been translations and there have been tours around the world, and there was a television miniseries which I co-wrote. But even without the kind of professional activities, there's a character, after all, named after my daughter, who stays with me for sure, as do other characters I've written. So yes, uh, but I wouldn't so much call it haunting, because
Mm,
that sounds kind of a little negative,
mm,
a little troublesome. I would say that she feels like a friend who's
mm.
there forever, and she stays and she's walking with me in my imagination and my heart and my soul. So I consider it kind of like a walking friend, as opposed to being haunted by something nefarious.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. That's interesting to know. Um, in your book, Aminata interacted with a lot of people, enslavers, African agents of slavery, and other enslaved people, some of whom demonstrate an incredible capacity to dream and hope for freedom. So, what were you trying to convey about human relationship under slavery?
Well, thank you. That's a big question, Ife. I guess, first of all, I was trying to convey that the whole world was touched by this horrendous commercial enterprise, the transatlantic slave trade. And a great many people suffered profoundly. They suffered physically, they lost their lives, they lost their freedom, they were abducted most violently. But also, even people who were perpetuating the slave trade were profoundly diminished, and their morality was attacked, uh, and diminished as well by participating in this horrendous nightmare. And so I guess I was trying to say that the whole world was affected, and even people who were perpetuating the slave trade paid a moral price for their heinous sins. And um, and I guess I was looking to kind of throw off the veil of obscurity that often sits over the face and the hands and the feet and the body and the soul of an enslaved person. Often, I think in North America, when people discuss slavery, the person who's been enslaved has no face or hands or feet. They don't have a voice. They don't walk in a certain way. They don't have a lover. They don't have children. They don't have skills. They're just a faceless victim, shackled. And they have no personality and or no dimensionality, and therefore it's almost as if we can't imagine what's happened truly to these human beings and how they could be just like us, and how any of us could be in a similar situation. And so I was trying to humanize this faceless, anonymous so-called slave and give her a voice and a way of walking and a lover and children and passions and skills and interests, so that I could lift her off the page and give her her due as a human being in and out of slavery. And I guess that was one of my primary goals, to lift this person off the page and to show her to be a person, a woman, a human being with all sorts of interests and capacities, not just as a faceless enslaved person.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. At this point, could you do a reading from the Book of Negroes?
Sure, sure. And I will say that I was reading slave narratives long before I wrote this book. I was even reading them before I wrote a second novel of mine called In Your Own Blood, which was published in 1997. And I've always been interested in slave narratives because, as I understand, they're the first form of literature to be written by Black folks that were read and published and understood around the world. And of course, Equiano is perhaps the very first, or one of the very first, to do such a thing, to write a work of literature that becomes recognized in his lifetime, well beyond his own geographical area, and it becomes known around the world. And it's such a stunning form of literature, and I teach my own students at the University of Guelph that if they really want to understand Black literature, they should begin at the foundation and to read slave narratives, because that's the first form of literature that we are publishing as Black peoples in the world. So this first little bit from the novel, the Book of Negroes, again embodies the idea of a fictionalized slave narrative. And here we find Aminata at the beginning of the novel, when she is near the end of her life.
Mm.
The other day, they took me into a London school and had me talk to the children. One girl asked if it was true that I was the famous Mina D, the one mentioned in all the newspapers. Her parents, she said, did not believe that I could have lived in so many places. I acknowledged that I was Mina D, but that she could call me Aminata Diallo if she wanted, which was my childhood name. We worked on my first name for a while. After 3 tries, she got it. Aminata. 4 syllables. It's really not that hard. Aminata, I told her. She said she wished I could meet her parents and her grandparents. I replied that it amazed me that she still had grandparents in her life. Love them good, I told her, and love them big. Love them every day. She asked why I was so black. I asked why she was so white. She
Mm.
said she was born that way. Same here, I replied. I can see that you are so very. I'm sorry. I can see that you must have been quite pretty, even though you are so very dark, she said. You'd be prettier if London ever got any sun, I replied. She asked what I ate. My grandfather says he bets you eat raw elephant. I told her I'd never actually taken a bite out of an elephant, but there had been times in my life when I was hungry enough to try. I chased 300 or 400 of them in my life, but never managed to get one to stop rampaging through villages and to stand still long enough for me to take a good bite. She laughed and said she wanted to know what I really ate. I eat what you eat, I told her. Do you suppose I'm going to find an elephant walking about the streets of London? Sausages, eggs, mutton stew, bread, crocodiles, all those regular things. Crocodiles, she said. I told her I was just checking to see if she was listening. She said she was an excellent listener and wanted me to please tell her a ghost story. Honey, I said, my life is a ghost story. Then tell it to me, she said. So I'll end that first little excerpt there. That's
Yeah.
near the beginning of the novel.
Yeah, that was a brilliant reading. And I must say that Aminata does have a sense of humor, right?
Yes,
In
she does.
to that
I,
student that way.
Thank you. If it was hard to get her voice down, and I didn't want her to be dry and interesting. I didn't want her to be consumed with so much bitterness and anger, which she had a right to, that she wouldn't be an interesting person to narrate her life. But I didn't want her to be sickly sweet or overly pleasant and just happy either. I was really trying to find the right voice for an old woman who had a sense of humor, but who knew who she was and what she'd been through and was never going to forget it, and who could be a bit playful, a bit indirect, uh, take it on the chin and give it right back as this girl's giving her a hard time. And it was really an interesting challenge to try to get into the head and the voice of an old Black woman in the 1700s after surviving a life of slavery and persecution. Actually, by the time she comes out of the page, it's 1807.
Well, the historical setting of the Book of Negroes is the 18th century, a period that produced several slave narratives, notably the interesting narrative of Olaudah Equiano, which apparently influenced your writing. In the Book of Negroes, Aminata gets introduced to Equiano's work by another character, and the book affects her immensely. She goes to London and asks about Equiano, only to discover his passing. I know, Lawrence, that you were influenced by the works of other writers, such as Frederick Douglass. But was there a reason you had to signpost Equiano's work in this way? And could you elaborate a bit on the influence of Equiano's The Interesting Narrative on the Book of Negroes?
Sure. Thank you so much, Ife. Well, first of all, as I mentioned earlier, the slave narratives have influenced me profoundly because they are so raw, they're so kind of direct, they're unvarnished. Some of them are written beautifully, others are written, in a more basic way. It almost doesn't matter to me how well written they are, though it's fascinating just to read them and to behold the stories. And they all kind of start the same way. This is my name. This is when I was born. This is what happened to me. This is how I saw my parents taken from me, or I was taken from my parents. And let me, dear reader, tell you my story. And they're really a form of abolitionism, and they're a form of protesting one's freedom and dignity and innocence. Um, they're a way of testifying to all the indignities and diminishments and difficulties that they've survived, as well as reflecting the loves and the successes in their lives. And so the slave narrative, the autobiography of the formerly enslaved person, is such a fascinating read. And I love that they all start on a similar path with this autobiographical immediate references, and also that they're addressing the reader with political intensity. Like, I'm telling you this story not just for fun, but I want you to know, damn it, that I'm a human being just like you, and I want you to hear my story because you thought that I was inhuman. You thought I was nothing more than a masked, unnamed, anonymous object, but I'm a human being and I want you to recognize my freedom and my dignity. And so there are political manifestations as well as manifestos as well as stories. And so I find them amazing. Um, Equiano's story particularly interested me because I notice it as he travels the world. And I love that idea that he's traveling the world after his initial enslavement. And my character, too, travels the world. She's on the move. She moves, of course, involuntarily and forcible, violent, abduction, across the lands in Africa to the coast and then over to over the ocean and then into slavery in South Carolina. But then she's free and she keeps moving. She moves to New York City. She moves to Nova Scotia. She moves to Sierra Leone. Then she moves to London to fight for the abolition of the slave trade. She is on the move. So was Equiano, and there's a worldliness to Equiano's story, a global reach to it, which I wanted to emulate in the Book of Negroes. And also, Equiano is profoundly curious. He's alive with interest and with passions and curiosities, despite the horrible things that happened to him at the beginning of his life. His narrative is, it could be, but is not consumed with bitterness and anger. It's consumed, it's full of curiosity and kind of an energetic exuberance for life. And I wanted to sort of borrow that idea because ultimately, Aminata is a human being who also is curious and full of love and has a person that she loves, profoundly, and has her own children and wants to live with exuberance and love despite the horrible things that have happened to her. And so Equiano's narrative influenced me profoundly because of its sunny resilience. It didn't diminish the things that had happened to him, but its sunny resilience I found really interesting. And it was so influential that I wanted to signpost it, as you say, Ife, to acknowledge it in the narrative. I wanted to say, hey, hats off. Most of you readers have probably never heard of Equiano, but you're going to hear about him in this novel because my character is going to go looking for him and has heard about his book. And so I wanted to sort of acknowledge him by embedding him briefly, but in an important way into the narrative. So really, it's a way of thanking him and acknowledging him. But there are many others, Mary Prince, Frederick Douglass, I could go on, whose stories were also very inspirational to me.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Lawrence. What I also like about your book, The Book of Negroes, is the education in this book. So there is usually a mindset that enslaved people had better treatment in Canada. And your book exposes that as untrue. Yeah.
Yes, and were you leading to a question with regard to that, Ife?
Yes, please.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand what question you meant to ask about that.
Okay. Well, Kerry can cut this part out. So what I was trying to say, of course, is the fact that there is a lot of education in this text as regards slavery in Canada.
Yes.
Usually when people talk about slavery in Canada, there is that comparison that we didn't have it so tough and that enslaved people had better treatment in Canada. But what you have done with the Book of Negroes is to expose that as a lie.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I think it's a completely um, unnecessary distraction that serves no value whatsoever to go about quantifying misery or to try to say that quantifying evil, to try to say that, well, slavery existed in Canada, but it wasn't as bad as that in the States, which maybe wasn't as bad as that in the Caribbean and so forth. And there are other atrocities in the world too, And often those arguments, people say things like that. There are other atrocities in the world too, as if to tell you that they don't want to be told how awful slavery was or that it affected Canada too. Slavery was embedded in Canadian life. It existed in Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Ontario, or those provinces as they're named today. Um, People were hanged and murdered as they were enslaved, including Marie-Joseph Angelique in 1734 in Montreal. Um, Slavery was so embedded in our political system, say in the provinces now known as Quebec and Ontario, that legislators had to really fight in order to enact anti-slavery legislation, and were not entirely successful in trying to do so in their earliest initiatives. Um, uh, Post-slavery, segregation of various forms continued to plague Canadians, certainly right through the 1960s. And so it's kind of useless to make that argument that it wasn't so bad here, because it sort of says, well, then why are we talking about it? It's a real thing. It was a real thing. People were enslaved. They lost their freedoms. So let's talk about how it played out here, as opposed to taking a measuring stick to evaluating how it unplayed here, how it unfolded here and whether it was better or worse in the States. It just doesn't really help us, or in other parts of the world, such as the Caribbean, it just doesn't really help us very much. It's sort of like saying, what was worse, the
Mm.
transatlantic slave trade or the Holocaust? Well, why would you have such a conversation? They are both monstrous iniquities. They're both heinous violations of humanity. Why compare them, and why try to establish a hierarchy of human evil? I just don't really see the point in that. So yes, of course, slavery existed in Canada until it was finally abolished in most of the British Empire in 1834, and it was a thing, and it affected people and affected the creation of this land. And so I think it's important to write about.
Yeah, evil is evil, Lawrence.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that. At this point, could we punctuate our discussion with a reading from the Book of Negroes?
I'd be delighted to. So in this section, Aminata is in London, and she's struggling with the abolitionists because on one hand, they are pretty well as good white people as she's ever going to encounter in London around the year 1805, 1807. They want to abolish the slave trade. They befriend her, they assist her, they try to control her in a kind of a condescending way, and she doesn't allow for that. But they are, on the whole, trying to be kind to her. But she notices that they don't want what she wants. They just want to abolish the slave trade, meaning the selling of human beings into slavery, but they're not ready to advocate for the abolition of slavery itself, which is what she wants. That won't happen till later. And so, what happens in 1807 finally is that the British Parliament abolishes the slave trade. It won't be until 1834 that they abolish slavery itself. So, here we are, Aminata is in London, struggling with these abolitionists who are, on one hand, kindly, and on the other hand, condescending, and they don't really want what she wants. The abolitionists keep plotting. Already there are talks of hearings into the slave trade, and one day, when the hearings are done, they will introduce yet another bill in Parliament. They say they can win this time, and I do want them to prevail. Their way is better than the alternative, but their way is not enough. The abolitionists may well call me their equal, but their lips do not yet say my name, and their ears do not yet hear my story. Not the way I want to tell it. But I've long lived the written word and come to see in it the power of the sleeping lion. This is my name. This is who I am. This is how I got here. In the absence of an audience, I will write down my story so that it waits like a restful beast with lungs breathing and heart beating. Thank you.
That's a very beautiful reading, Lawrence. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for reiterating that part of the novel, because Aminata is always insistent on identity and how she's called. Yeah,
Yes,
thank you so much.
thank
So I
you.
know a lot of research went into the writing of this novel. You've also traveled to a few places. So can you describe some of it? And in what ways did this kind of research, which exposed you to the traumas of slavery that you relived through writing, affect you as a writer?
Thank you. Well, let's start first with how it affected me, because of course there's a not a complete, but there's a partial list of many of the sources that I consulted at the back of the book. I can mention a couple of them, but there is a list at the back of some of the main ones. And I was researching, for 5 years, for the entire time that I was writing the novel, I was researching simultaneously books, maps, articles, slave narratives, letters that people wrote, and of course, interviewing experts who knew a lot more about things than I did. So often, once I'd done a bunch of research, I'd go to a person who was known in the field and ask more questions about how things worked. So there's a great deal of research of different sorts, but I'd say that the most profound research was to read first person accounts
Mm.
of enslaved people and of slavers themselves and of people who witnessed the unfolding of slavery, even if they weren't perpetuating it or enslaved, to get their first person accounts of what they saw. For example, if not for having come across a first person account by by a certain Scottish doctor who was traveling inland in West Africa, one of the first Europeans to travel inland in West Africa in the 1700s, I would never have found out how um, African peoples were trafficked forcibly and violently from their villages or wherever they were taken to the coast. I would never have understood that they were attached by the neck and walked in these kind of long lines of walking villages of people in what are called coffles, Coffles, along, attached by the neck, often forcibly forced to walk for months at a time until they got to the coast, where they were sold into pens and then into slave vessels. I would never have understood how that worked if I hadn't read a first-person account of it myself. So the first-person accounts were immensely helpful. But the effect on me is maybe something more interesting to share with you because it's more personal. You know, sometimes you see an actor talking about being in a movie and they might say, I had nightmares after acting in that role. Well, I had nightmares when I was writing this book, and it was, you know, incredibly painful. Um, it is really important to find a way to get your reader through a painful story, but also to get yourself through a painful story. So I had to have a few techniques to let some shafts of light, many shafts of light into the story, so it wouldn't just read like an incessant plague of violence and disruption, because who would want to stay with that for 500 pages? You have to give a reader hope and a reason to turn the page, just as you have to give a child reason for hope and to get out of bed in the morning. And so, even if hope may be delayed, gratification may be delayed, you have to give a reader and a child and other human beings, of course, hope. And so, letting Aminata begin to tell the story when she's an old woman is a way of putting some hope into the heart of the reader, because the reader knows that no matter how bad things will get, Aminata is going to survive to a ripe old age, because that's where the story starts. She's at a ripe old age, and then she goes back to beginning to narrate her life from the beginning. So we know she's going to make it from the first pages, make it to old age. So that's a way of giving hope. And then there's love and there's friendship and there's playfulness, there's irony. There's not a lot of sort of swashbuckling humor, you know, because the novel didn't come to me funny. It didn't present itself as a funny story, but I really tried to let a lot of shafts of light into the story in order to alleviate the pain of the reading. But yes, it affected me terribly. The parts that were most painful, like the middle passage, or when she's abducted, or when she sees her parents murdered. Those parts I tried to write quickly. And then when it came to rewrite, which I do a lot, I tried to rewrite them quickly so I wouldn't stay too long in those painful bits. And also not linger too long in them when I'm writing. So, you know, if you can tell a painful story in 3 pages instead of 15, it might be better. And also you can give a reader a taste. You don't have to show everything. You know, reader can figure out that this is a representation of a hard life. They don't have to see everything. And so all the horrible things that would have happened to her could never be contained in a novel like this, or it'd be unreadable. So a few of them will suffice.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Lawrence. I'm sorry about all you had to go through in the process of the production of the Book of Negroes.
I just say, I'm sorry, I'm not sorry. And thank you for saying that, but it was a wonderful experience. It enriched me profoundly. I wanted and needed to do it, and I came out the other end just fine. But it was, you know, let's be honest. I mean, writing often is not a happy thing. It can involve a lot of pain, especially if you're exploring painful subjects, whether they're fictional or autobiographical. And so many writers deal with pain, you know, explore painful issues, and so naturally feel pain when they're writing. But it's part of the process, and it's liberating, and it's necessary, and it makes us feel that we sort of seized life and held it and understood it and kind of processed it better. So I feel grateful for the experience as opposed to feeling regret about it.
Yeah. And also, Lawrence, I understand that you actually saw the real Book of Negroes in England when you went visiting the Queen. How was that moment like for you?
It was great. I mean, the Book of Negroes, for those of you who don't know, is a British naval ledger kept by the British Navy in 1783 to record the exodus of 3,000 black folks who were fleeing New York City after serving the British on the losing side of the American Revolutionary War. And as a reward for serving the British, some of them were spies, soldiers, cooks, road builders, prostitutes, midwives, men and women with their children in tow did everything they could to prove their utility to the British because they were promised freedom by the British if they served them during the war. And so, as a reward to these folks who've served them, the British evacuate them to what they think will be a safe place, Nova Scotia mostly. If you go to Germany and Jamaica and Quebec City, but most of the 3,000 Black loyalists leaving New York City go to uh, go to Nova Scotia, and once their names are entered into the Book of Negro. So it's a British naval ledger, which is a fascinating historical document. And I read it online, and I saw photocopies of it in numerous places in Canada and in the States before going to meet the Queen. But finally, when I was invited to meet her and have a conversation with her after winning a prize, um, I went the next day to the British Archives to see the original copy of the Book of Negroes in the National Archives in Kew. It was really stunning. It was amazing. It was great to touch and see the original. I'm amazed they let me touch it with my white gloves on, but it was great. It was really something. And I was kind of tickled that the Queen, she confessed that she hadn't read the book, fine, and that she didn't know the story. And I felt kind of amused by the idea that a man from Toronto, Canada, a black man from Toronto, Canada, was telling the Queen something about British history and telling her about the Book of Negroes, which she did not know. She was very kind, and I enjoyed meeting with her. But it was just lovely to be able to tell her something about British history.
Yeah, that's interesting to know, Lawrence. And this is my final question now because we do not have so much time left. The Book of Negroes ends on a somewhat happy note, right? Aminata reunites with her long lost daughter, May. In other words, the story appears to end on what might seem like a joyful note, especially given the traumatic experiences that happened at the beginning of the novel. So, how do you feel about this ending? Should we read it as granting release to an experience that is so horrifying?
Well, I wouldn't tell you how to read it. I mean, each reader will make their own decisions about how to read it, and so I don't really believe as a writer telling other people how to read it, but I'll tell you how I intended it, and then each reader can decide what they want to make of it. For one thing, Black folks are moving around the world at this time. The Black loyalists, they're on like an intercontinental milk run. They're going from Africa to the 13 colonies on the east coast of the United States, what later becomes the United States, still British provinces. They're going up to New York City. They're going to Nova Scotia. They are going to England too, because many of them are traveling to England as well to advocate for better conditions in Nova Scotia or to advocate, for freedom. And so they're moving around and they know each other. And there are Black folks in England at the time too. And I like the idea. In fact, I got this idea by reading Equiano, that if Black folks were in London, which they were at the time, there was slavery in England too. That some of these folks would know each other, and they would know each other. They'd know how to find each other. There'd be a community of Black folks, and so if Aminata's daughter has been abducted and ended up in London, and then which was the case, and if Aminata also ends up in London, there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be able to find each other because it would have been a small Black community where people would have known each other, especially because Aminata becomes quite famous, like Equiano, when she comes to London because she's invited to meet Parliament. And so she becomes a bit of a superstar, because she's there to speak to Parliament about the evils of slavery. And so I thought that it was realistically viable to have her meet up with her daughter. And morally, she's gone through such hell that why not give her a moment of happiness and joy in her life before her life winds up? Um, so I felt fine about it. Readers can make up their own mind, but she's going to be released in death anyway from this life. But I felt it would be beautiful to allow her the chance to reunite with her daughter, at the end of the story. And so I chose to do so. But I wouldn't read too much into it. I'm not trying to alleviate the evils of slavery or anything like that. I'm just giving a person a shaft of life, and a shaft of light and of joy in the beginning and also at the end of the novel. And why not? She's gone through hell. I can't see why she can't have some pleasure too.
Yes, and thank you for that ending, Lawrence. Just before we go, you have to do one last reading for us.
I'd love to. It's a short one, and it's really my favorite. And it's my favorite because the hardest thing to do, the most important and vital task for a novelist, I think, is to get into the voice, into the head, into the heart of your character and show how that heart is beating. And here Aminata is a young girl. She's about 12. She's washed up half dead on the shores of South Carolina. And her word for white people in her language, as she doesn't yet speak English, is tubabu. And here she is, washed up half dead, waiting to be sold into slavery on an island just off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. We were brought to an island just off the coast of the Tubabu's land. There were about 100 of us left. We were all placed inside a square barricade. Tubabu stood as sentries at the gate and patrolled inside with clubs and fire sticks. But mostly we were left alone to wonder what would now become of us. It seemed to me that we had traveled to the other side of the sun. On this side of the world, the sun was worn out and not to be trusted. My fingers grew thick and numb every night and throbbed every day as the sun climbed the sky. My ears were cold. My nose was cold. Like the others, I'd been given a rough cloth, barely long enough to wrap around my backside. I shivered at night on the sandy earth, and one morning I awoke to find smoke trickling from my mouth. I thought my face had caught fire. I thought that someone had bedeviled me during the night, or branded my tongue. I waited for the burning. I prepared to scream. I held my breath. No smoke. I breathed. Smoke again. It came from within me. No burning. Just smoke. The smoke in my breath continued until the sun began to climb the sky. And then I noticed that others too had smoke mouths in the morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lawrence, for that beautiful reading and also for your time. It's been a pleasure discussing with you today.
Thank you, Aoife. It's been a great pleasure to meet you too. And now that I've heard about it, I'm going to find a way to find your novel and read it. I look forward to that.
Thank you so much, Lawrence.
Thank you to you both.
Yeah, thank you, Kerry, for the introduction.
That was just wonderful. And I just wanted to say a couple of things. I have so many thoughts, as I'm sure our audience will as they're listening to this. But, thank you for writing Aminata's story, because in historical terms, the numbers that we have are around 22 million people captured from Africa throughout the duration of the slave trade, and 12 million people landed on the other side of the Middle Passage. So those at least 10 million lives lost. And one of the few stories we get of the Middle Passage, because enslaved people don't get to write their stories, is Equiano's. And whether he actually did experience the Middle Passage and survived it is still a matter of historical inquiry. Whether he got the story as a collective memory from many people around him in South Carolina, or whether he really was brought across, perhaps we will never know for sure. But I think what you've told us, Lawrence, is that these stories will find a way um, through to be told, and it's so very important. So thank you very, very much to both of you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
And thank you, Kerry, for organizing this brilliant conference.